Today we'll go on that one.
Dave Napier or something.
Okay, because I'm the only one. Mike Moore, he can't see it. Turn around here, face the... please. I would like to welcome everybody here, and whilst we're talking about Mike Moore, can you give us a carrot here, please?
Kia ora tātou. Before I start, just in the karakia, I will be acknowledging the passing of Marge Smith, whose tūpapaku. Her body is lying at Whakaki, where Pierre is officiating as the co-matua. I'll be leaving at lunchtime to go to that tani. Marge was widely known in the Māori community on Māori TV and Hawke's Bay Kahunguna radio. Yes, she will be sorely missed. Me karakia tātou, he huaka mātou ki a koe I tēnei ata, ki rongi te aroha mo te whānau pani I noho mai I whakaki I te wehinga tua tō mātou kuia a March, ko te tūmana ko te ngākau, ka haere ki rongi te rangi maere, ki tua te arai, o rere e pā. Mana ki tia I a mātou te hunga ora e kore rero ngā mea e pana ki te kaupapa o te rā ki rungi I te mātou a Māori. Ho mai takaki I tō mātou tia mana Rex rau ko tōna tūmoaki a James me ngā kai kauni hera e mahi ana ki raro I te te pūnei. Ko e nei mea ka pātai ki rungi te ingo I hukarati ake amene.
Thank you, Mike, and I'd like to welcome our visitors with us today, and our staff, and a reporter from Hawke's Bay today. Good to see you. And apologies. We have an apology from Rick, Peter, and Paddy. I guess he's at that tangi already, is he?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Happy to move, Chair.
Apologies. Tom, you second them? Thank you. All those in favour? Aye. Are there any notices?
Just one, Chair. Depending on how the meeting goes, I'll make a call at 12:30. I may have to leave at 12:31. But we'll just see how the meeting's progressing. I can update them.
Okay, you did tell me that, Fenton. I'm sorry, I forgot. We'll put that in the apologies as well. So, are there any conflict of interest declarations on the paper today? There are none. So we have 2 lots of minutes. You're saying we don't have to? We're going to have one
because you confirmed those ones at the 20th.
Oh, okay. So that's a mistake there. That's fine. So we are confirming the minutes on the 20th of March. Which are pretty brief. It was an extraordinary meeting. Do we have a mover? Or are there any corrections? Do we have a mover? Paul will move. Tom will second. All those in favour?
Aye.
We'll confirm the minutes of the meeting on the 20th. So follow-ups from, or matters arising or follow-ups from previous council meetings.
They're all self-explanatory. There's a couple still to come, Chair, so happy to take questions from councillors in relation to any of
Any
these.
questions on the follow-ups? Tom?
Yeah, one of them does include this page of discussion of some of the transport questions that arose when we were discussing the transport public consultation document, page 6 here. And the question I was most concerned with is addressed here to the extent of saying that we have great difficulty, in fact, determining how many passengers use our system. And I have some further thoughts on what is said here, but I don't want to take the time now, so I'll make a point of talking to Anne and Alan about it further, if that's okay.
Well, Mr. Chairman, could I just make a comment about that? Anne has provided some responses there, but her responses are limited to the issues that were recorded in the minutes, and she's done that deliberately. But there were a number of other issues, some of quite significance, and she is working on a memo for distribution to cover those points. And also, I'm of a mind that I believe that we need a short seminar or engagement discussion, perhaps preceding a meeting fairly soon, to try and engender a better understanding of the issues relating to public transport. So the fact that her response is limited is due, in fact, to, if you like, limitations of the minute keeping. But is it appropriate to ask Anne just to comment?
Yeah, and I think it'd be fine.
Very quickly, just to say, Councillor Belford, if your question relates to the number of passenger trips, we do record that, and we have very clear information about that, but we can't tell how many individual discrete people at this time, because people aren't required to give their name and address when they get on the bus. So once we have the new ticketing system in place, people who have registered cards with us, we will know how many of those there are. But that still won't provide a complete picture.
And all I'm saying is I appreciate what you're saying about that, and that we can measure passenger trips, but this is a service to customers, and it's incredible to me that a business doesn't know how many customers it has. And I just think there are some other ways we could go about determining that, and that's all I want to have a further discussion about. I'm not going to make a big capital case, but we do now have a public document that says it could be as few as 1,400 people. You say that's not likely to be the case, but for all those folks out there who complain about looking at empty buses traveling around the countryside, now there's a public document that says we have 1,400 customers using that bus system, conceivably, and we don't think that's a real number, but it's an extrapolated number. We ought to know better what the usage is. We could buy 1,400 people a car. It wouldn't serve other purposes of this council, but we could do that and save a lot of money, couldn't we?
Yes, well, there was the suggestion.
I don't think we'll debate it down.
Okay,
Tom's raising a point.
With your consent, Mr. Chairman, we'll follow through with a memo to be presented at an appropriate time where the issues can be discussed for an hour, say.
Okay,
great.
Mr. Chair, I totally endorse Councillor Nick's desire to get the issues on the table, and that's a good thing to do. But in terms of the detail, that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of a strategic document. We do need to have that discussion to say what is the shape going. I mean, we're talking about a long-term strategy for transport, and we need to know where we're heading. Is what we're doing now tinkering on the margins of it the right way to go, or should we be thinking about what the system should like in 10, 15 years' time? And that's possibly a discussion we need to have as well.
Yeah.
Just finally, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that, and we will try and facilitate just that. And can I say that other regional councils actually have public transport committees, as does Horizons. In talking to Anne, we don't believe that that's necessary here, but certainly perhaps once a year a good round table is justified to enhance understanding by everyone.
Yeah, I think the point that Neil is highlighting, that if any, it's one of the industries that is going to be subject to huge disruptive influences and a very dynamic environment in the next decade, and we need to be on top of that. Is that where you kind of... And I agree with that. Reading the report, there wasn't a lot in that, and it was a very operational report, and that's fine, but we do need to get into the other dimension of thinking as well, where we're going. But anyway, I said we weren't going to debate it, and there I am debating it. I have a couple of comments myself before any other comments. That very pleasing to see News Hub and Greenpeace watching us on our Christmas party costs and our investment portfolios. I imagine we've answered them, have we? We'll do our best.
So certainly in terms of the Christmas party one, but the one in relation to councillors and their connections with the agricultural sector, that's still an active one. And
that comes straight off our governance.
Look, it does.
Does
but
it really?
So councillors may yet receive requests for further information from staff, so we can answer those adequately. So expect to hear from us if we've got any queries.
Yeah, just, I mean, the likes of shares, farmland shareholders, we're all minority shareholders, so that's not actually required to be listed in our interest register.
Yes, and
How deep are you going in this is my question.
I'd also
Happy to provide what you need, Chair.
Well, I'm happy to provide.
Well, it's great if you could indicate that you are all comfortable to provide it, because there will be actually some debate about what's official information here and whether or not you are obligated to provide this information. I mean, obviously, if it needs to be within the conflicts of interest register, then yes.
Is anyone not happy to provide this information?
I can confirm I'm not a shareholder in Greenpeace, Chair.
Sorry, Chair, I've just had an update. And,
or the Christmas party.
And I have been advised by Mrs Hooper this has now been answered, and the response was that the council does not hold any of the information other than what's in the conflict of interest register on the basis that it's not official information, so it doesn't meet the test for the Act. So it's. But if you would like to contact Greenpeace individually and provide them with information about your private lives, I'm sure they would welcome that.
Gee, that
Mr Chair,
would be a novel, wouldn't it?
can we have some sort of advice or direction as to whether holding the schedule of requests there, if one did have those sorts of interests, is that a conflict? I'm doubtful that it is.
Well, look, it would depend on the decision taken on any given day, and I guess where they're angling here is that there are regulatory and planning decisions and a whole raft of decisions that are made in relation to resource management, which might have an impact on farming activity. But look, there are general rulings I'm aware of that the Office of the Auditor General's made, because as councillors you make decisions all the time that impact every resident, including your decisions as ratepayers. And so there has been rulings on that fact that you still are empowered to and need to make those decisions. It's where there is a very specific personal interest, obviously, that this arises. And those issues were traversed some time ago in relation to the Ruataniwha.
I mean, I've got 4 cows. Do I qualify? Am I in or out?
Those cows have got you in trouble before.
So I would suggest if we're making planning and regulatory decisions in relation to your particular piece of land, which you're affected, then maybe yes.
They were referred to as a herd.
Mr Chairman, I'm still missing a pig.
So am I. No, I think actually, I'm really happy to supply it, and I think it's it's very pointed. It's not. It doesn't say, do you have an investment in a shoe factory? Anyway, are there any other issues there?
So long as we're compliant with the legislation, then that's fine. Thank you, Liam.
Yeah, that's probably right. Okay, do we have to move the follow-ups? No. We do? Okay, do we have someone to move that we receive the follow-ups? Paul, again, come on. Yeah. You're sitting opposite me. Benton, you second that? All those in favour? Aye.
Aye.
So, minor items not on the agenda.
Chair, climate change rally. Sorry. Climate change rally.
Yeah. No other minor items? No.
Okay.
I'll have one just for the sake.
Yeah, I thought I was looking
Parliamentary
at you.
Commissioner on the Environment.
What? Sorry, what was it?
Parliamentary Commissioner on the Environment.
You mean his recent statements this morning? Okay. So we move to decision items. Item 6, page 13, if you're not there, report from the Corporate and Strategic Committee. Neil, would you want to run that, or should we get Jessie?
I'm happy to do that.
Jessica?
Chair.
Yep.
Thank you. So there are a number of items that were covered at the Corporate and Strategic Committee, but there are 2 decision items brought forward to Council today. One is regarding the financial delegations, and the other is asking Council to adopt the Health and Safety Charter. So I will let Joe talk through any questions in regards to the Health and Safety Charter, and I'm happy to take any questions around the financial delegations.
Any questions for either party?
So, Chair, just through you, the only question I had about the charter is that it will be a living document, and as things change, legislation changes, we have more, court-discussed incidents to learn from, etc. We will be making iterative changes.
Absolutely, if that was necessary, yeah.
Chair, can I just also just draw Council's attention to the fact that under the financial delegations for items where there's no provision made in the LTP or their annual plan, we have provided some alternative wording following on from feedback from the committee that essentially they did not want any discretion available to staff to make decisions outside of what sits in the LTP or annual plan, including with respect to the contingency. So that wording is intended to meet the Council's expectations there.
Debbie, do you have a question?
I do. It's on a matter that was under the Corporate and Strategic, but not in these, in the paper here. So it came to our attention during the Corporate and Strategic meeting, I think, that there was only 40 million invested with managed funds, and my understanding was that we went out and consulted on 50 million going into managed funds. So I flagged where has the extra 10 million gone, and I still think that needs a little bit of oversight, because who gave the authority to not invest the other 10 million, and where is it, and what are the implications for the ratepayers in terms of how much we had budgeted as income for the long-term plan?
So the other 10 million has been committed to as a loan facility to HBRC, and that was brought to Council as a formal decision. So Council did resolve to pass that resolution. So we are receiving the same return from HBRC on that 10 million as we forecast in the long-term plan for the diversified investment portfolio. So there isn't any lack of income on that investment income.
So charging HBRC for the interest, and it's to fund the port transaction.
Yeah, so we expect that we'll get that 10 million back as part of the proceeds.
And that was a resolution of Council?
Correct.
I recall. Any other questions?
Well, just a statement that Annie Dunkus is leaving, of course, and her farewell is on the 11th of April.
Yes, we know that. Okay, do we have a mover to accept the recommendations? Neil, would you move it so you can speak to it? Moved by Neil. Do we have a seconder? Paul, do you wish to speak, Neil? You don't? Paul, you don't? You do?
I'm okay.
Okay, although anyone else wish to speak? All those in favour of accepting those recommendations from the Corporate and Strategic Committee? Aye. Against? It's carried. 7, Freshwater Security Scheme.
I'm just going to invite Ellen Humphreys.
Tom.
I was going to invite Ellen Humphreys to speak to the paper and to the policy. And, maybe I'll just add some comments at the end, and we can take questions if that's okay, Chair.
Welcome, Ellen. The floor is yours then.
Kia ora, everyone. So I last presented a draft of this paper to Council at a workshop on the 30th of January. The structure of the scheme is much the same, with 2 parallel work streams, one called the the Regional Freshwater Assessment, and the Ready Reaction Fund. The Ready Reaction Fund has is to enable us to start on some projects that through plan change processes and consultation we already know that there is a need and a desire from the community to start investigating these options, and those are the Heritonga Flow Enhancement Project and the Tukituki Water Security Project. And the Regional Freshwater Assessment, according to some of your feedback at the workshop, we've enhanced the emphasis of conservation and efficiency measures as strategic actions to be investigated through that assessment. And some of the other key changes we've made to the scheme following your feedback were clarifying the issue around the conflicts of interest. We've just simplified that and just related it back to our existing clauses, and clarifying that enabling high value land use is not the same as grandfathering current land use. We want to open up for innovative and new ways to be productive but reducing degradation to our environment. And we've also edited the scheme or the policy around it to ensure that we're leaving ourselves open to opportunities to leverage central government funding such as the Provincial Growth Fund, and just leaving ourselves open to make the most of those opportunities. Are there any questions?
So, Tom, do you want to add to that before we go to
I'll just make the comment that I am aware that this has come from a workshop that not all councils were in attendance at, and straight to council, and that was in part due to some potential dates coming up in relation to the Provincial Growth Fund. I don't want to talk about the Provincial Growth Fund a lot, other than to say that we are, as every council is in the region, in an engagement with them, and we've got a very constructive relationship with them and working on a package, but how that package goes is at the whim of central government. Through that process we do have quite strong alignment and support, particularly from Napier City Council and Hastings District Council, who obviously have an interest in water security in Heritonga, and clearly the same for Central Hawke's Bay District Council. In terms of Tukituki water security, and the part of the thinking behind the regional water assessment is also to give us an opportunity to explore opportunities in Wairoa and needs in Wairoa, so we are trying to cover the region in that regard. So look, happy to take any questions or comments around the policy.
questions? Tom, and then Paul.
Question?
Yes.
The paragraph in the policy itself, page 33, fund governance, seems, I'm assuming the fund we're talking about is not the fund item 5, which is although I would like the Environment and Services Committee to have authorize an overarching governance of the Provincial Growth Fund, but I assume you're referring to the $5 million. Is that
That's a big ask.
So it's partially correct, but it would be that if we were successful in terms of any Provincial Growth Fund application for this, then the same would apply, obviously under a completely reconstructed, renegotiated set of arrangements.
So I have comments, but not further questions.
We'll wait for the
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
then back to you, Benton.
Yep, I have two questions, Chair. If I look at the policy itself, 2.2, the scope, this is page 29 of the papers. You've got the long-term plan makes available $5 million over the next 3 years for water augmentation. The long-term plan itself then goes on to say not fixed to any particular scheme, but available as a grant fund for technical investigation and feasibility. Can you assure me that this policy isn't in breach of that, the rest of that approval in the long-term plan? it's not fixed to any particular scheme at the moment. There's still stuff that's, I mean, I understand that the regional freshwater assessment and the Ready Reaction Fund are essentially a breakdown of work streams that you're doing under that gambit.
Can I perhaps just have a go at answering that? So at the time that the long-term plan was consulted on, the funding was not at that point fixed to any particular schemes, but it was certainly intended that the funds themselves would be allocated towards specific scheme investigation. So it was more a case of, at that point, this is a general fund that's being created,
yep.
And as we're starting to see things arising, particularly out of the tank process, for example, we are seeing that those funds will be directed towards particular projects, and we're getting increasing clarity about where those funds, at least some of the funds, are likely to be apportioned to.
Okay, and that's what this policy is kind of designed to do, is to allocate those things. Okay, that's good. My other question is on, is again going back to the policy itself, 7.1 funding allocation. This is page 33. I had some concerns when I was thinking about this particular policy, that we were perhaps allocating money without knowing what it was really all about. But going through and rereading the paragraph there, it's quite clear that this particular table was actually set out in our long-term plan. I think it's just, can I recommend just a small change in the wording in the second sentence where you go, funding has been allocated evenly over 3 years. Can we just change that to funding was allocated evenly over 3 years? Because that's what actually happened. It was allocated as part of the long-term plan. That would give me a comfort.
You okay with that?
Yes, Chair. And look, I'm going to sort of preempt perhaps some of the discussion that I think is coming and sits in behind one of the questions here, and suggest that under 6 fund governance, second paragraph where it reads, the Council's Environment Service Committee will authorise and provide overarching governance. I suggest that we add to that, will authorise funding allocations and provide overarching governance of the fund. So if we add that wording in, it's clear that the authorising here means that the NS committee will be the final authoriser of funds allocated. Is that?
I'll never look at it.
Is that something that councillors would support?
Yeah, I think that's a very good suggestion. Affixing, you had a question?
I'm just interested in, there was a comment there about trying to include Wairoa in this policy. Can you point me in any place that specifically includes, I mean, it's obvious Wairoa's got 60+% of the region's fresh water. I get that bit. But where else do we fit in here?
So a couple of
pipeline.
In 3.1.
$1 a litre.
It's my page 6. But under 3 regional freshwater assessment, the first objective of that assessment is to update our analysis of regional freshwater availability and supply, with special regard for growth opportunities in and around Wairoa. So, yeah, we're very aware that there's a lot of opportunity up there and want to make sure that we're capturing that through the freshwater assessment.
And so the freshwater assessment is designed, the intention behind the freshwater assessment is that the bulk of it is very much a strong scientific evidence-based or analysis or of the opportunities. And we're also aware that the Provincial Growth Fund has commissioned some studies for Wairoa, and one of which I think has just been made publicly available. And so if there are opportunities flying from that, we hope that the work we do in understanding those assessments could align. And so we're obviously aware that there's strong horticultural potential up in certain land areas in Wairoa, which is going to have issues with not only getting water away in terms of drainage, but also, security supply of water for perhaps watering trees and plant survival. So it's a matter of being a little bit more granular about that. And I suppose the final point I'll make is that In terms of Tuki catchment and the tank catchments, we've done a lot of deep dive and analysis, and it's a recognition of the fact that we haven't got to Wairau yet, and so it sort of helps us get up there before we go rolling through there with all the analysis that accompanies a formal plan change.
Okay, thank you.
Neil and then Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Obviously, this is a troubling paper. Can I take you to page 29 at 2.2, the scope? Long-term plan makes available $5 million over the next 3 years for water augmentation. Perhaps we ought to be slightly rephrasing that because the rest of the report talks about assessing issues around water supply and water. So can you say that, in fact, the investment will be in augmentation projects? Is it the nuts and bolts and bulldozers and diggers, or is it in plans thereof, assessment thereof?
It's assessment thereof. I don't believe that this fund is big enough to support of its own. And I think you're correct. I think that probably in terms of those words, water augmentation, I mean, it's certainly investigation and feasibility projects around overall water security, but I think water invest... Can
I suggest then this very slight adjustment to the wording, so that the long-term plan makes available $5 million over the next 3 years for water assessment augmentation options which meet the scheme's purpose.
I would want a further amendment to that because I was going to raise the same issue. This paper takes pains to say, in response to issues raised during our previous discussion of it, that it's not all about water augmentation. It includes water efficiency. It includes better land use, a whole range of alternatives out there. And so with that in mind, I was going to propose changing that phrase simply to over the next 3 years for water management, which would sweep up all of those kinds of different possibilities, as opposed to saying water augmentation.
Why don't we do that?
Just as a question, Chair, does that, I mean, we've gone out and consulted on the long-term plan, which is very specific in its wording.
Yeah.
Do we have the authority to go ahead and put anything, if we're going to change the scope, and I haven't got any problem with that, but can we have to tie the wording of the long-term plan back into that? I don't mind if we change the scope to water management, that's fine, but in terms of saying the long-term plan made available $5 million to do that, it's actually not the case.
No. So, look, I just want to check the absolute wording from the consultation documents. I'm not sure that we just said just augmentation. I just do need to double check that. You think we did?
Part 3, page 33.
No, it's what the paper says. I'm just checking the consultation document from the LTP.
Yeah, that's what I've got here. It's part 3, page 33.
Of the LTP document as opposed to the consultation document?
As opposed to as the actual long-term plan.
I'd suggest that water management is far too broad a description.
So I think
it embraces everything from regulation, enforcement.
You're right, okay.
It is there, James, is it?
Yeah, certainly in terms of the LTP document, that's correct.
Yeah, well, that's what we consulted on.
So I would be, for me, I'd be a lot more comfortable if we actually put in that whole first paragraph from the long-term plan, because that says not fixed to any particular scheme, but available as a grant fund for technical investigation and feasibility, which is what this security, the spending in the security scheme is based, and this policy is based around.
You mean put in that entire sentence?
Yeah, because that's what's in there. That's what's in the long-term plan.
So you're opposed to spending money on examining water efficiency?
No, I'm not opposed to spending money on that, but we haven't consulted with the public about spending money on that.
So I think the umbrella if I may, Chair, the umbrella we're putting this under is water security. And I'm not trying to nuance words here, because I think And if I'm just taking our lessons from the tank, the tank conversation, which was very strong around, we're going to look after the awa first, and if we're going to deal with the impacts of groundwater abstraction through a flow enhancement scheme, that's going to be, entirely for an ecosystem benefit. And so effectively, it's augmentation, but for a wider purpose. And I suppose the connotation is of, you create augmentation in direct link with, greater availability of irrigation. Yeah.
Well, I would say that I would say the conclusion of tank was that you don't talk about water storage or augmentation until you have talked about water savings in the system. And no proposal for water storage or augmentation is certainly going to get my support if that discussion hasn't occurred. So if this policy is written in such a way that is not kosher to talk about water savings, then I'm going to oppose it.
And so that's entirely the key thrust of the regional water assessment piece, was to run the ruler again over future supply-demand scenarios.
Well, that's what I see. I see that in this paper in various forms, but I hear Councillor Bailey saying that's not an appropriate purpose of this fund. So is it or isn't it? If it isn't, I'm opposing the fund.
He's not saying it's not appropriate. He's just saying we didn't
consult on it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Well, look, I think
it's appropriate or not.
So, look, 2 points. First of all, in relation to what is the definition of water augmentation. So, I think you can argue that the augmentation is adding water to the system, and whether that be through aquifer recharge, above ground storage, or flow augmentation in lowland streams, for example, from pumping groundwater to improve ecological performance. They're all examples of adding water to the system to get better outcomes. So I think the water augmentation covers the range of different interventions that we might imagine that come into this. I think it's necessary for any design of any augmentation intervention of any of those three to understand what is the overall water management context in which that's occurring. Fortunately, both with respect to the Hiritonga system and the Ruataniwha system, we actually have plans in place, one operative, one working towards being operative, that drive water use already towards the policies are for allocation for what is only efficient and necessary use. And we've got clawbacks happening, obviously, in the Ruataniwha system with the minimum flows flowing in. So we already have a planning and regulatory framework that drive efficiency of use, and this is nested within that. It's notable that central government's funding is premised on the idea that there has to be a regulatory framework that is driving water use efficiency and limits, including around nutrients, before central government funding would be applied to this. So I guess in both of those areas where we've got water stress, we are well advanced as a council in terms of the planning and regulatory framework to support any investment here. That work is already being funded in other parts of the council's work. So we're currently working with irrigators around water use efficiency, both in Central Hawke's Bay and in the Hiritonga zone. That sits alongside this. I don't think necessarily we need this funding to drive those actual activities necessarily in terms of staff out there working with water users on most efficient use. But I think the augmentation piece is broad enough for us to do some work around what is the overall water management context in which that's occurring.
So Mr. Chair, can the Chief Executive give us a view as to whether the use of the word management would be consistent with the consultation and long-term plan wording? We've had so far management, efficiency, augmentation are words that we could use. Would the word management be consistent with the terms used in the long-term plan?
Look, I think it depends on management of what. In terms of managing a particular body of water and how augmentation might fit into that, I think the answer is yes. If we're talking about this fund funding water management obviously includes the policy rules and what have you that sit in the planning work stream, and so that's the tank.
For this purpose, you think?
Well, I think it's yes when it comes to a very specific water body. So take, for example, the tank catchment. With respect to the Ngātaroto, for example, we know that we have a water scarcity issue there, and so work around managing flows in the Ngātaroto and how augmentation fits in that, yes, within scope for this fund. For managing the whole Hiritonga system, this is not the appropriate funding mechanism, and we have other funds dedicated to that purpose.
So if we bring this to a head, if we take Councillor Bailey's point, I would bring you to point 3 under the freshwater assessment funding objective for the assessment. Point 3 on page 7 of the document, 31 of our paper, says that one of the uses of this, or one of the purposes of this assessment, is to investigate new and emerging options to improve water security and reliability. Number 1, conservation and efficiency. Number 3, distribution and offsetting, new, innovative, blah, 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 blah. Those two would be inappropriate uses of this funding. The only appropriate use of the funding would be water storage. So which is it? I mean, is 3, I read 3 to say that this assessment is going to look at the entire picture of demand, savings, look at what is needed after you conduct that analysis. Yes, we need storage here, we need augmentation there. That's the logical sequence of doing this assessment. So can we spend $500,000 doing that assessment, or can't we?
So, Councillor, if I go back to my starting point, we're not talking about this just being storage, we're saying augmentation. And if augmentation is cast as adding water to the system, then conservation and efficiency adds water to the system. It adds further availability. Yeah. So I think if we think about augmentation in its broadest sense, then this policy can be consistent.
So 3 stands as written.
If you're comfortable with conceiving as augmentation as how do we add water into the system.
Why not take it out?
I'm reading 3 as it's literally stated on the page here, and expecting that we will, in fact, spend money to look at water conservation options.
And I would expect that would be a necessary part of any hard engineering solution that would be looking at adding more water in by way of groundwater recharge or above ground storage.
Yeah, and you've been funding irrigation efficiency workshops in the region as well, part of that?
Yes, we have. Yeah.
Can you live with that, Tom?
I'm just going to keep reminding you that item 3 says conservation efficiency, and there are probably 8 or 10 other references to water conservation and efficiency in this program, and no augmentation scheme, including the 2 itemized here, get a free pass. They need to meet that test.
So that's absolutely what the policy seeks to achieve, and that's certainly the staff view about what's the most prudent way of expending these funds.
So back to Neil's.
So we stick with augmentation? Is that what we're doing?
Well, I think in terms of consistency with the long-term plan, that's appropriate.
So you're okay with assessment of augmentation options which meet the scheme's purpose? Is that everyone comfortable with that?
Yes.
Because that's what it's doing. It's not augmenting, it's investigating it.
Correct.
Yep.
Mr. Chair, can I continue?
Yeah, we need to put that in though, that's quite important.
And look, $5 million won't buy you an engineering solution for any of these things, right? So we know there will be a further call on council capital.
Which brings me to the question
should we go
including Wairau in it specifically. $5 million go nowhere in Wairau. But that's another question. Can I go to the criteria? Scheme criteria 2.3. And you've got achieving the objectives consistent with the principles, achieve multi-value benefits. And if I could take you to those benefits over the page, on page 6 of 30, and you've got a schedule of the multi-value benefits. Can I now ask, given the scope of the multi-value benefits, what group or groups of folk would you envisage would be applying to the fund and meet those multi-value benefits? Is it someone that's contemplating a dam augmentation, or what is it?
First, I'd like to highlight that those multi-value benefits are not a tick list. So not every project has to meet 100% of every criteria.
You'd expect them to meet one or two, though, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and it's more a recognition, it is to ensure that anyone who's applying to the fund is recognising that we live in a system now where, and I mean we always have, but it hasn't been recognised this way, where you can't just build a dam for purely profit or economic reasons with no regard to the environment. Whatever we do, we have to be very conscious about the context it's going into, not only the environmental context, but the social and the way that people are using the water for recreation and in all the ways that water is a taonga to us. So that's the first point I wanted to highlight. It's not a tick box. So I don't think the criteria haven't been made with any particular group or investment in mind it hasn't been made to particularly discourage or particularly encourage any particular group.
Yeah, and to which I'd add in terms of, people applying for grants to this. This is not being conceived as a fund that people will necessarily, anyone in the public would apply for, and it could have been, but as it's put to you now, it's not proposed to operate specifically in that way. That doesn't rule out, of course, any member of the public coming up with an idea and discussing it with us and it being approved through the appropriate processes as something worthy of investigation. Look, and one of the reasons for that is because of, I suppose, the policy or the general direction from this table is not to create a situation where we exacerbate sort of a rush on the fund so that people can accelerate, individuals can necessarily accelerate their applications to the last residual bits of high flow allocations that sit around the district and provide an opportunity for much more integrated community approaches to high flow allocation that's remaining around the place.
So just a question of clarification around that, Chair. So Tom, what you're telling me there is it's not the fund, this policy is not intended to start a fund for anyone from the public to actually apply for money to do these things. It's intended that we'll be managing this ourselves.
So in contrast to something like the erosion control scheme.
Yep.
So have you said that anywhere in here? Because it's a very significant point. That change in philosophy.
So it's not stated. It's not stated that it's not. Well, it's certainly not stated in here that this is an opportunity for the public to apply. I mean, this is a statement about how we propose that these funds are spent.
And this policy is intended as a administration fund, administration guidance. So this isn't a handout to the public and this is the criteria to apply policy.
I think you need to be specific.
Neil hadn't finished.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I think you need to be specific. If it's not a contestable fund, it's not a contestable fund.
I think it's a good idea.
And the other thing is, this is a question. The Provincial Growth Fund is mentioned. I'm assuming that this funding is, in effect, the local share to support
If the Provincial Growth Fund application continued on its current path, it would form a significant share of the local fund. But I think it's also important to note that the Provincial Growth Fund application has got widespread support from other councils in terms of an all-of-region package, and who knows, there may be an opportunity for co-funding from other TAs.
Yeah, and you can't at this stage talk about the specifics of the provincial fund application, but would it be fair to say it will build upon the purposes of our own funding?
Absolutely it would, and as the policy notes, if obviously we can't predict which way the Provincial Growth Fund will go, and or even if we were successful in application, what the absolute detail of that application would be, which is why we've reserved within the policy the requirement to effectively come back to, I think it'd probably be the E&S table at first instance to discuss that.
I want to come back to Neil, but before I do, Alan, the regional mayors have highlighted water security as the biggest challenge for our region, and they are absolutely 100% behind it as the number one priority for this region. All of them. Neil.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, it's the criteria and non-contestable fund. I mean, the public must be awfully confused in trying to understand this significant amount of expenditure. If it's non-contestable, why don't we just nominate the parties that will be eligible for the fund, or we're talking to around the fund? I mean, it's entirely confusing. But I'll take you to page 33, the fund governance. And I appreciate the Chief Executive has wanted to qualify some of the move. And I wonder whether, in fact, the second paragraph, it says the Council's Environmental Services Committee will authorise and provide overarching governance of the fund. Whether, in fact, we say that the Corporate Environmental Services Committee will authorise expenditure on all projects and provide overarching governance.
We'd already put in funding allocations, so it must have come up.
Is that what that means?
Correct.
Expenditure is coming back.
So we already said the Council Environmental Services Committee will authorise funding allocation and provide overarching.
That's what that... It'll come back to Council to make a decision.
Yeah.
Correct. Tom.
I want to go to the other point that was raised in the previous discussion, covered in 6.2 of the staff memo on page 22. Clarify that enabling high-value land use does not necessarily equate to grandfathering current land use. Rather, it enables opportunities to develop new and innovative high-value land uses. A noble sentiment. I would bring you back to my favorite section 3 here of 3.1. I could find nowhere in the actual policy document that suggested that was the case. That was what we intended to include in our consideration here. And it does seem to me that in item 5 on page 7 of the policy, where it says identify and prioritize with communities, et cetera, I would like to add the words after efficiency, the last line there, land use improvement, storage and innovation. And the point of that is that in the overall assessment, and we're talking here about the overall assessment still, there are a couple of issues, including land use issues. There are land uses that make more or less efficient use of water. We need to be open to considering whether those kinds of changes need to occur. There are land management issues, soil management issues that affect water retention, et cetera, and effective land management can result in substantial water retention, lessening the need for other kinds of of interventions. So it seems to me in this assessment process, we're not only looking at security of supply, and by the way, Mr. Chairman, I don't think the four mayors probably know a dime's worth about what water security means or entails or what the right strategies to achieve it would be. But be that as it may, I'm glad they generally like the concept.
They know their regions can't go anywhere without it.
Fine. Efficiency, land use improvement, storage and innovation is what I would recommend.
On 5.
So that, on number 5 there, so that we are looking at all of the elements that constitute what our water needs might be.
It's in here under 5, page 31. No problems with that.
Well, my question, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Skirman is, would those alterations hamstring you or the executive in implementing the objectives of this scheme in terms of the overall objective of water security?
Look, certainly introducing the focus of the regional assessment to broaden out onto better land management options. I wonder whether it's beginning to do the work of the overall thrust of the NPS, which is effectively narrow down the range of options of farm management anyway into the future. And I think also in terms of the policy focusing on water security and effectively, in some respects, I suppose the high-level proposal for the likes of, say, the Heratonga flow scheme as it sits in the draft tank policy is effectively to attach a price to existing use as in terms of sharing the cost, spreading the cost of flow enhancement across existing water users. And so I think that's one of just many tensions that is driving towards higher and better land use and driving behaviour for more efficient land use, more efficient water use as part of land management.
Tom, can I ask you don't think that's covered through conservation, efficiency?
No, not at all. I think you could look at existing land use on the Ruatanifa Plains and say, hey, we're growing a lot of pasture here year-round for dairying on gravel soils. Is that what we're going to support here? Are we looking to augment water to do that? More of that? Yes or no? That's a fair question to be on the table in this assessment.
I think it goes to the question of how you think about water use efficiency. You can be efficient within the existing system, or you can look at the efficiency of the use of the resource relative to the output it's delivering. And look, I don't have any concerns about adding land use improvement in here, but I think Tom's caution is that this is a limited amount of money we're talking about here. There are other drivers of land use efficiency, including nutrient management, etc. And the extent to which we're going to try and understand all of those factors and drive some degree of central planning around that is limited by the available resource and the fact we've got other tools that we're managing those other things for. So I think when we're thinking about interventions, we do need to think about land use and the best use of that land and whether or not there are other ways of achieving more water availability in the system than simply adding more stored water or more groundwater recharge water into the system. So we can look at all that, but the extent to which this is going to fund the central planning.
What's the fear behind not making it explicit? That we have to question whether we're making the best use of our land, and that there are land uses that are better uses of our water than others.
It's just a caution that the available funding here may preclude diving very, very deeply into what's a very, very complex space around different farm systems and how they retain water or how they most efficiently use water, etc. I mean, there's a spatial scale thing here as well. You can obviously do this across a whole basin, or you can get right down to farm scale and within farm systems, etc. We're talking about $450,000 or $500,000 for a regional assessment here. So, the extent to which we're going to dive really deep is limited.
What was your wording exactly, Tom? You wanted in the land
use improvement.
And Joe, you know,
It's fine.
it's fine. Tom, you're fine?
Look, I think, fingers crossed, if we're successful in the Provincial Growth Fund application, you know, there may be a bigger budget to spend here to.
I heard Fenton had his hand up, actually. Did you?
Well, just a question, Chair. I mean, this is, you know, you get to item 6 and there's a whole process that goes around any of the spending anyway. And, you know, we're trying to turn this document into something it's not. I mean, it sounds like we want to turn it into something that's going to have a direct look at the RMA and the rights of individuals to farm certain aspects of land in certain ways. I mean, we're working through that stuff in a range of other activities. I just, you know, we could nickel and dime this all day. We could write another 6 pages, but really...
I suggested 3 words, not 6 pages.
No, but it could be the start. Who knows?
Yeah, okay. Debbie.
Yeah, that was exactly where I was coming from. So, James, question for you. We live under the MPS of Freshwater Management. We've got the RMA. We've got our Regional Resource Management Plan. When we are looking at the Council's E&S Committee authorising funding allocation, we're getting into a gearbox space, not a governance space. So how far down is that funding going to be micromanaged, and how much is that going to curtail Tom getting on with the job?
So, look, I anticipate that the specific projects funded out of this fund will be reasonably large chunks of change, and they will come to the NES committee with a work program and a breakdown of funding. I wouldn't expect that every last line item of those will, you know, be approved on a month by month basis by the NES committee as the projects unfold. There'll be a process at the end to approve a budget, delegation to staff to go away and to spend that budget, and then there'll be periodic reporting on progress on the way through. So we will certainly not be seeking to constrain the efficient running of projects, but we will ensure the NS committee's got a good oversight of the budgets at both the front end, midpoints and the back end.
It would be very interesting if these came through as blind applications, so councillor influence can be minimised.
Well, look,
to the facts.
I think it's important there is transparency. So, and again, this is not an open to all comers fund. This is one where we start with a regional assessment. We identify the options, and they'll be, you know, visible both to councillors and the community.
Well, that's interesting considering the disposition towards Central Hawke's Bay around some of the table. But in terms of what's been changed, the track and paste. Where are we at with this? Because there's been quite a few words.
I'm going to go through it. I'll go through it, dear. I've made.
Thank you.
Points. Paul, another question?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I have to agree with the inclusion that Tom was suggesting about land use change, and I don't see it as being this particular fund is actually that's the sole driver for it or anything like that. I don't expect, because as James has pointed out, there is a whole heap of other work going on in other work streams. But what I do like about having that wording in there is trying to keep all those work streams tied in together, because one of the complaints we've had, or one of the challenges we've had as a council, was there's all these different silos and work streams going on all over the place, and unless we put the wording in there to make sure it is tied together and it's kept top of mind, so I think that's a useful addition in that respect.
I don't know how many times this committee has sat around, or this council has sat around and talked about the issue of our water issues start on the land, and yet we're afraid to say that in a policy statement.
No, we're not. We are saying.
So Mr. Chairman, we say that out of our last discussion that we said explicitly, the staff memo says we do not want to grandfather current land uses, and it seems that it ought to be a transparent, simple matter to roll over into the policy statement something that reflects that is our view of the world, that we're not grandfathering. There's no free passes here. We're not grandfathering any current land use. Whatever it is, growing apples, growing tomatoes, I don't care what it is. We're not grandfathering anything as we review what our water needs are and how we're going to meet them.
Exactly right. Alan, can we get these questions?
Mr. Chairman, look, I respect Councillor Belford's right to have his very strongly held views, but I'm really concerned that that ideology runs the risk of putting constraints on a program like this, and the concept of this council or a committee picking winners and picking losers is anathema to me, and in many cases is illegal. So I think we should keep this thing fairly general and allow James, Tom and the staff to get on with the job.
So you don't agree with the changes which I'm going to go through in a minute?
I don't particularly know.
Can I just go through we're looking for a mover. We've had a pretty good discussion on this, move in a second, but before we do that, let's just, we are receiving this paper and
We're adopting it.
We're adopting this paper. Just go through on page 29, 2.2 scope, we added in assessment of augmentation options. Instead of saying for augmentation. On page 31.
All right, so you're changing that to the long-term plan makes available $5 million over the next 3 years for assessment of
augmentation options. We all happy with that addition? The staff were happy with that addition?
Yeah, again, that's not what was in that's not what we consulted on the long-term plan.
Well, it's pretty...
I think it's fairly consistent.
Yeah, augmentation.
Okay, in the interest of consensus, I'll wear that one.
On page 31, that is number 5, halfway down, through conservation, this was what Tom wanted to add, efficiencies, storage and innovation, and land use improvement. Alan won't like that, but how does everyone else feel about that?
I'm happy, Chair.
Well, who's the decider on that?
Well, it's being proposed, and someone will presumably move these amendments to the document.
No, I mean, who?
Who
I don't mean around this table, but, who's...
Well, look, they'll need to be included as part of the strategic actions and initiatives.
How can you say that burying 10 hectares underwater forever is land use improvement? I mean, it's quite hypocritical. Yeah, taking it down to the last.
It's pretty broad.
It's micromanaging.
I can live with that, Chair.
You can live with that, thanks, Fenton. On page 33, this was the big one, on governance, we said the Council's Environment and Service Committee will authorise, and it just said and provide, but we put in there funding allocation and provide overarching governance. We maybe should say provide overarching governance and funding allocation. That means our big items, they come back to the Council.
So Chair, it's probably technically better to say that the NS Committee will recommend to Council the authorisation of the allocation of funds and provide overarching governance.
Happy with that? Recommend to Council.
So does that change the delegations manual, James?
No.
You have to go and redo that?
I mean, most of these funds will be over Tom's delegation. I mean, my delegation is to implement the annual plan, and I guess the question is, we've got a big bucket at the moment. This is providing more granularity over it. I'm comfortable.
Okay, with those changes, do we have a mover?
There was a further change, Chair.
A further change?
Yep.
Oh, I missed one.
You did indeed. 7.1 changed from funding has been allocated to funding was allocated.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah, no, that was one. So just give me that again, Paul.
Instead of, on 7.1, instead of saying funding has been allocated, you're saying funding was allocated.
Was.
Yep.
Okay. Tom, you're going to move?
With those changes, yes.
Those changes, do we have a seconder?
Mr. Chair, I'll second, but I wonder whether I could indulge you around the recommendation 3, which says adopts the freshwater security as proposed. That's in the paper itself. And I'm interested to get some feedback on subject to council reviewing the scheme within 6 months.
Just a minute.
It doesn't need to be a widespread review, but given that a lot of the scheme is premised on Provincial Growth Fund outcome, then we'll have some experience of the applications coming forward. At least a discussion or review may help us recalibrate after our result from PGF.
Chair, the funding for this did arise prior to the Provincial Growth Fund applications being developed, so it was independent. The caution I'd have about 6 months is the ink will be barely dry probably on contracts with the Provincial Growth Fund should we be successful. So it'd be very early to evaluate the performance of the fund. My preference would be that it's just rolled up as part of the review going into the next long-term plan, which we'll be into next year anyway. So that seems like a more appropriate time to be considering whether this fund continues.
Yeah. All right. Why I'm suggesting a short turnaround is that the outcome of the PGF will be very influential on how the allocations are made and the direction of travel. If there's a big response from the PGF, that will be influential, and ditto if there's not, it'll go the other way, and we may need to rethink how we work this scheme.
I'm happy for us to come back to the Council for further discussion about this if we're unsuccessful with Provincial Growth Fund. But if we're successful, given the huge amount of work that will then precipitate, I'd be reluctant to throw a review of this into the mix, and also to signal that this policy is up for review just at the moment that we have secured central government funding. So it would only be in the event of a decline from PGF that I would recommend that we go back to the drawing board in any form.
Well, we'll definitely go back to the drawing board then.
And I would add that the policy says that if we are successful in the Provincial Growth Fund, requires us to rewire this policy, then we come back.
Do we need to say that, Neil? Because if we haven't got the money, we're going to definitely, and we want to still do this, we're going to have to find the money. They're going to have to come back to council to do that. Do you have to say it?
We won't be doing a review just before the next election, Chair. A future council can review all of these as and when they see fit. So it's just.
I would suggest that we would be, whether you call it a review of this policy, maybe I wouldn't necessarily say we need to do that, but we'll need, let's say, in the June Environment and Services Committee, for example, we would have an agenda item that spoke to, so let's review the bidding here. What has happened with the Provincial Growth Fund? What have we been given, not given? What's the impact of it on our work plans? That would be a legitimate, perfectly appropriate moment to take stock. Okay, we're on the path we thought we were going to be on, or not.
So I'd be comfortable with an additional recommendation that directs staff to report back to the NS committee on the progress with the Provincial Growth Fund applications and any implications for council policy arising from that.
It'll be part of your annual report, though, and you go through and you work out what's left over, what's not.
It will as well.
It's carried forward.
I think if James is happy with that, then let's just move on. You're the seconder. You've got to move in the seconder.
Well, just one last point, Mr. Chairman. Where and how do we make it clear in here that this is not a contestable fund?
So Councillor, if you're
not necessarily a contestable fund.
So if you're happy to propose some words, I mean, staff will.
Well, I'm not quite sure where it should go.
Well, we could either just use the word non-contestable somewhere in the
Purpose.
In the purpose, yeah.
All right, well that's quite vital, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we add in purpose and non-contestable.
But I have to agree with Councillor Dick on that one.
You have to what?
I have to agree with that.
Yeah, good. Righto, we're going to move in the seconder. With the amendments that we have agreed to, Tom. Are you clear on all those? Floor is yours.
Speak to.
Yeah.
So I am pleased that with the assessment that is contemplated here, that will take a presumably holistic view of what our water needs going into the future are, how they might be threatened, what alternatives are best suited to meeting those, what we have to reconsider in terms of land use along the way, and so forth. All that part of this I'm enthusiastic about. The aspects of singling out two projects in particular, I can live with, given that under the governance arrangements for this policy, those or any other projects will go through a appropriate vetting process, and so that they can be enthusiastically supported when the time comes. Thank you.
Bill?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. This paper's clearly troubling. This is how you do not make good policy. This is how you make bad policy. And we've got this as a classic example.
Are you a seconder?
Yes, I am. It doesn't dissuade me from commenting on the process. And I appreciate that it's been a very fraught process, and staff have done the very best to try and make the most of a sow's ear, a pig and a poke, all of those words that come to mind when you're trying to construct a good policy. I totally reject some of the comments made by my colleagues around the table this morning that we somehow open the door and get Tom to get on with it. That's one of the words I heard from Councillor Dick earlier. Just get on with it. Well, I'm sorry. This is governance. This policy making is governance. This is why we are here, and we are to set the framework so that Tom can get on with it. Well, all we've done here, if you look at those criteria, I have no idea who's in the frame to get some of this funding. I have no idea. The public won't either. All we've done is had some mysterious subtext as to how this whole scheme's going to work. I'm just appalled by our own processes in this regard. Go back to the issue. I mean, my colleague Tom has tried to insert a broader term frame of reference for the fund. He's tried to suggest that let's bring into play other water saving opportunities. Any project that looks like that has no show of getting over the line in this. They might as well not even bother to apply. So I was rather sceptical to even see the words go in, because that is not on the table. And I concur with Councillor Belford's view that we ought to, when specifying and developing policy of this nature, be as broad brush as we have intended to be, that we are looking for comprehensive, catchment-wide, systems-wide change. This doesn't do this. This is about 1, 2 or 3 augmentation projects, dam projects. That's what this is about. It's not to do with those things that Councillor Belford has asked for. That's the reality of it. And that's my concern, that we have given in to the process, that poor governance at the government and national level, and we've replicated and duplicated that at our level. I'm very disappointed in this paper, and that we have succumbed to be a party to that sort of poor policy making.
You knew it was a pretty good seconder, right? Councillor.
Well, I just can't support Councillor Curtin's comments. I think they're unfair and they're offensive, and I believe the staff have done the best that they could under the difficult circumstances that exist at the moment.
Penton.
Thank you.
Just briefly, Chair, I will support this. I think what this does do, and the piece that's been missed here is, if you're the regulator of water in Hawke's Bay, you don't have any choice, but you are a key influencer in the economy, full stop. And I think that is a linkage here, that we keep talking about we're the environmental agency. Well, actually, we do more than that. If you're controlling the water, by default, you have a key influence in the economy. And I think, some of the work that's going to happen here is going to bear that out. So.
Other speakers? Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I have to confess that I had some concerns about this paper when I read through it, but after going through the discussions, I'm a lot more comfortable with the direction or the policy itself, especially around the fact that at the end of the day, all we're doing is implementing what we consulted on through the long-term plan. I also happen to agree with Councillor Belford, and I made comment about it before, is we need to tie all these things in together somehow. We seem to be having a policy which silos a particular line of thought, which again ties into what Councillor Keaton was saying about if you had read this paper initially, it was all about augmentation or building storage dams. So taking that further and taking all those other issues into consideration, like land use, I think is really, really important. Doesn't mean that we have to go and spend a whole bunch of money on it through this particular scheme, because we have got there are other funding avenues for that, or other work streams going on around that. So I've changed my mind from what I taught last night. I'm going to support this paper through and this policy through as it is. Thanks.
Any other speakers?
I think it's really unfortunate that we go out to ratepayers and source money, and then a year later we work out how we're going to spend it. I think we should be doing this the other way around in future.
No other speakers, Tom? On the final say?
I'm through.
So we have the recommendations was to receive and note and to adopt the freshwater security scheme as proposed and as amended by us, and I think we picked all those up and agreed. All those in favour? Aye. Against?
Abstain.
One abstained? Because you don't like some of the amendments?
Because I didn't like some of the things I heard.
Okay, thanks, Alan and Tom. Appreciate that. That was a bit of a battle. What we got there?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Tom.
So we are moving to fix the common seal, item 8. Do I have a mover? Or we have a mover. Fenton, seconder. Tom. All those in favour?
All right.
Thank you very much. Item 9. So moving into the council-controlled organisation. We've had a lot of discussion around this, but we need to...
I'm happy to make a few comments.
Thanks, Jessica.
So this paper is to provide some feedback received around the submissions. So this is an analysis paper. The next paper following this is the decision paper around the creation of a new CCO. So I'll just make a few comments, and then if there's no questions we can move on to the decision paper. So the consultation for the establishment of a new council-controlled organisation ran for 3 weeks. In terms of communicating to the public, we made a media release. We did some newspaper advertising, and we informed the public via social media. We were happy to send submission forms out if anybody wished to receive a hard copy. 5 submission forms were mailed out on request, and 200 submission forms were issued to Port staff on request. The purpose of the submission form, it wasn't a yes or no answer. So we posed 2 questions through the submission form. One was, what do you support about the statement of proposal, and what don't you support about the statement of proposal? So you'll see the analysis is laid out in terms of providing some feedback around the responses in that regard. So there is an account in terms of a yes or no vote. So we received 84 submissions, and we've broken those down into 4 sections: those who generally supported the proposal, those who generally opposed the proposal, and then those who stated opposition but didn't actually give any feedback or relevant commentary. The main themes received across all sections really within the submissions were around governance, accountability, simplicity and efficiency, and there were quite a few questions and comments posed around the future of the Hawke's Bay Regional Investment Company. So we've included some of the quotes from the submissions to provide a bit of context to the key themes, but they're generally sort of as stated, and then we've provided an officer's response in terms of staff feedback to some of those key themes through the submissions, and we do feel as though a lot of the questions or concerns raised are specifically around governance and the future of HBRC. We have responded to, and I think around governance, they're particularly covered within the shareholder protections paper, so we have asked you to read those in conjunction with this paper. And the future of HBRC, we've made some notes within this paper, and staff do suggest that we conclude the review that's currently underway and we come back and discuss it as a separate matter.
Thanks, Jessica. Are there any questions regarding the analysis of these submissions? Paul?
Thank you, Chair. This is just a question for you, Jessica. Paragraph number 11 on page 38. You would agree that 92% of submitters opposed the creation of a council-controlled organisation. That's putting the numbers into a percentage.
I haven't done we haven't really calculated in terms of a yes or no vote, because I think we're trying to encourage substantive feedback through the questions, but it sounds about right.
I think the caveat I'd make on that is they didn't actually state they opposed to CCO. They just said the Napier Port's not for sale. So what they thought about a CCO, one can only surmise or draw conclusions. They didn't actually state that position.
Okay, then if I go back then to if I look at 11.1 and 11.2, where these are people who specifically stated that they oppose or support, there was 70% of submitters opposed to the creation of a council-controlled organisation. So out of the 24 submitters that had expressed an opinion, 17 said no and correct. 7 said yes, which is 70%.
Yes, that's correct.
Right, okay. I'll bear that point in mind when discussing the next paper.
Okay. Sure.
Mr. Moyne?
Well, could I say this? Dealing with such small numbers is almost completely irrelevant.
You think?
Was that a good question or not? Or was that
I think we've tried to respond to the key themes as opposed to focus on the numbers.
Any other questions before we move to?
Well, just Mr. Chair, does the port use 1080? Where do they use 1080?
We had categorised that as irrelevant to the subject being consulted upon.
What was the other one? There was another one.
Happy to move to.
Thank you. We're going to move in a second. And Tom, just to speak, Fenton.
Oh, well, it's nothing really to add other than it was quite a general range of issues discussed, some particularly relevant to the discussion, and it's useful. It's always useful to go out to the community to see what the views are. But in a representative democracy, we have to digest all that stuff, a range of other conversations, a range of other reading, a range of other workshops, a range of other decisions, how it all ties together, and we have to make a call based on all the information presented to councillors in a representative way.
That's correct. Tom?
My takeaway was mainly that there was a beneath it all, a really strongly expressed desire for a clear line of sight between us as councillors and the governance and operations of the end result at the end of the day. However that was achieved, and some people suggested other ways of doing it, but that's what everybody clearly wanted to see. There were clearly a whole series of these submissions were basically opposed to the transaction, period.
Yeah.
And so you take that as it is. But in terms of what was behind people who had actual concerns about the structure aspects of this, it seems to me it was mainly about making sure that we feel as a council, or we can reassure the public that we have as a council a very clear opportunity to direct this enterprise.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you, Chair. I have to kind of agree with a comment that Mr. Mohi made around the number of submitters. That there was a number of submissions that were made. I would have thought that given the supposed amount of interest that the public holds in this whole transaction, that there would have been more comment made about it. And especially given the amount of comment I've heard over the years about council-controlled organisations themselves, and especially HBRC, again, I would have thought there would have been a lot more interest expressed by the public in the council-controlled, the formation of a new council-controlled organisation by us. But be what it may, that's the way it was.
Any other speakers? Ben, do you want to wrap us up? Okay, so we are just receiving and noting the analysis, not the substantive issue. So all those in favour? Aye. Against? It's carried. So we will move to item 10, which is a lot more substantive. And this report is driven by Jessica again.
It's me again. So this is the formal decision, and staff are recommending that council do proceed with the establishment of a new CCO to facilitate and provide the corporate structure to facilitate a minority share issuing of Napier Port. So it's important to just remind councillors that this is not we're not asking councillors to make a decision to proceed or not to proceed with an IPO. That's a decision for a later day. This is a decision for this to be the preferred structure should that decision be made to proceed. So we would ask that the previous paper, which provides the analysis of submissions, is taken into consideration with this paper.
Questions?
Yeah, I have two, I think, Chair. The first one is the eventual constitution of Napier Port Holdings Limited. Who approves that? Would that come back to this table for approval? The actual constitution itself? Because that's something that maybe should have been clear in the paper and it wasn't.
So that will be part of the decision making on the 1st of May, and so it goes to the shareholder protections paper, which is the next item. There's a range of matters that do need to be reflected in that constitution, and the final constitution will be brought forward for ratification.
Okay, that's cool. The other one, the other question I have, I suppose it's more of a comment, and this goes back to what I said in the previous paper about the percentages and about how we deal with feedback from the consultation that we receive from the public, because in our paper that we had around the actual IPO decision, or the decision to do that in principle, the percentages of support or otherwise for the different options was included as part of that paper, yet it's not been included as part of this paper. So to me, that's a bit of a difference in terms of the message we're giving to the public about how we consider consultation. And Jessica, I know you spoke a couple of times about how people voted or whatever. I think, and this is perhaps not a question but more of a statement, James, is it possible that the staff, when they're considering how we communicate the results of public consultation, that we try to get ourselves away from this whole concept of it's a vote. So in other words, the reporting on percentages should become less relevant than the actual content or themes that come through in the consultation, because to me that's the far more important thing. I think it's a philosophical discussion rather than more than anything else. But if it's something that staff could consider talking about at some sort, having a discussion about at some stage,
so
I'd really appreciate it.
But we totally agree, and that's why I think you'll see in the previous paper there wasn't percentages, and there was a focus on the substance of the submissions and an analysis on that. And indeed, Councillor, I think it was you that was drawing percentages into it. So we were very clear that this is not a vote, and what we're always looking for in these processes are thoughtful, substantive submissions, not one-liners.
Yep, but my point is there, sorry, Chair, James, my point there, James, is a number of the communications we put out, they talk about the numbers of percentages that supported this option or that option and everything else. And that's what I'd like staff to have a discussion about. Is that actually creating divisions within the community because it creates winners and losers, or is it something that actually is really useful and adds to the discussion? I'm a particular mind about that. But
that's a fair point. We'll take it on board.
Any other questions?
Move, Mr. Chair.
We'll move.
Happy to move.
Thank you. We've got to move. Do we have a seconder? Tom, seconds. Neil, do you speak?
Oh, just briefly, Mr. Chair. I think the reality of creating a CCO is essentially just a technical process that should we proceed with the port transaction, it's in the ratepayer's best interest to have such an entity established. I think our background and rationale for creating the CCO is very much focused on that. Having said that, the submitters to the process have made some interesting and relevant points, and I think the overwhelming sentiment that's come through, I think as high as 70% of the submitters have reflected that the council needs to have line of sight on the transaction, that we need to be there every step of the way. And I've already made my views quite clear that there needs to be strong councillor representation in that CCO mix, so that all of those views of council and the protection of the public interest in the port are well and truly protected. So for me, Mr. Chair, the whole the takeout from this exercise in terms of consulting the public is reaffirming a strongly held belief that councillors, elected councillors, need to be in charge of the process.
Thank you, Neil. Tom?
I just second those comments and say that this is, to me, just a technical formality, and the real discussion is in the following paper, where I think, as Neil has previewed, we will be seen or not to have provided for that kind of oversight that I think we heard come through this consultation process. So the actual creation of the CCO is a ministerial step along the way.
Speakers, Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. If we do proceed with the IPO, which is a decision we have yet to make, this is the right vehicle to be doing that through. So, there's a technicality or whatever you want to call it. So I'll be supporting the creation of the new CCO, and of course there are some other interesting discussions to be had at the next paper.
Speakers. Okay. Tom, do you want to wind up, or you? Neil, sorry, do you want to wind up? Okay, we have mover and seconder, and just so everyone's very aware, recommendations are 1 to 11, and I'm very pleased that we're now calling Holdco Napier Port Holdings Limited, which sounds a whole lot better. So, all those in favour? Aye. Against? It's unanimous. Thank you. Okay, shareholder item 11, shareholder protections.
Blair with us, so we might invite Blair up to speak to this paper.
Blair. And Jonathan's here too. Welcome, Jonathan. Didn't see you guys sneak in. So Blair, you take us through this one.
Thank you. Look, you have the paper.
Sit right up there so everyone.
Do you want me right in the front?
Yeah, well, I can't see you probably.
Everyone can see you on
look
video.
At your eyes, mate.
Going to sit with Jess because we're doing this together.
We'll get her up there.
So look, the paper's in front of you. The council had a workshop on this matter and reviewed a variety of protections. They're all tabled fairly straightforwardly in the paper in front of you, and obviously contingent upon the decision you've just made, and also contingent upon any decision to proceed with the IPO. So I think the best option would be to take questions, Chair, and I'm happy to do that.
Questions on the paper? Debbie?
Can you take the decision item separately?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yes. Please.
The recommendations. Which one in particular do you want to be taken separately?
Well, I'd look for 2.4 separately and 3.5, unless you can split that out into a 3.5 and another, break that up into 2 points. Because I would have thought that the Napier Port will continue to prepare and publish its SCI, full stop, and then it should be a next bullet point for the other parts of that recommendation.
I'm happy to take them separately. Any other questions?
Thank you, Chair. The remuneration for the directors of Napier Port Holdings Limited and Napier Port, because they're the same directors, is going to be the same. There's no extra remuneration for it. They're only getting one of the director's fees.
That's correct. Essentially, it's an appointment to one company but split into two.
Okay, it is, because it is in one of these papers. I can't remember which one it is, but it is.
They don't get remunerated twice.
Yeah, absolutely. But the other thing we're talking about in here is the appointment of council non-independent directors, so it's council-appointed directors. Now, they, regardless of where they come from, they will also will be able to. That'll be subject to a director's fee on, regardless of what they're doing otherwise.
That's a matter for a separate decision, but I think the starting principle will be that there's work involved in those activities and some form of fee would be appropriate, but that's a separate decision. So today, all that we're tabling is that you create two non-independent director positions, and with the detail of that to be determined as part of a separate process.
Okay. Yep.
And that's the item we're going to take, so we'll take that separately and we can debate that separately. Any other questions? Well, do we have a mover for everything bar 2.4?
And 3.5.
And 3.5?
Unless you're going to split it up.
I'll move.
Wait a minute, I just want to go through 3.5. No. So why would you want to move that one separately? You want to talk about that separately?
You just want to split it out, is that correct?
Yeah, I think the port should continue and have a statement of corporate intent. I don't have a problem with that half of that recommendation. So I certainly wouldn't want to be voting against that basic governance principle.
What do you mean split it out? You mean...
Just put a full stop under a tent and then the next one just carries on. That the regional council, you can keep your words in there.
So you want two different recs. You want it split into two recs?
Yes.
Yep. 3.5.1 and 3.5.2.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. But we'll take it on the yeah. Okay. We have to move to vote these separately.
No, you've already had that.
Don't we have to?
No, we're just taking the vote.
We'll just take this up. Okay, fine.
Move the whole lot, Chair.
Well,
No.
But you could do and then take the vote separately.
yeah.
Okay, no, that's probably...
Well,
yeah.
You've already had a mover and a second.
Yeah, we have. So we're going to move the whole lot as one, and then we're going to...
Yep. What I heard you say, Mr. Chair, was you're taking a mover and a second for all but 2.4.
Yeah, that's... Yeah. Well, that's what I thought I said.
Back on that.
Okay, no, that's what we're going to do. I'd rather do that, Fenton, and then we can come back.
No, that's fine. Just so we're clear.
Okay, we have a mover and a seconder.
I'll second.
We had you moved, didn't you, Neil?
No,
Alan moved it.
Alan moved, Tom second. Do you want to speak to it, Alan?
Look, it's been well discussed, and I believe the recommendations are well formulated.
Tom?
I think the recommendations are well formulated, but I think the communication of this, despite the fact that we're going to have a relatively brief discussion of it here today in this session, the importance of how these various protections get communicated, I think is hugely, hugely important. And including the existence of, under the law, what the existing rights of the shareholder are, and how those get executed and protected and so forth. Huge amount of non-knowledge about that topic amongst the general public, which creates a great deal of angst. Our discussion of it all was, to me, very informative in terms of what all those different protections are and how they apply and so forth, to which we then added a series that go beyond that to suit this particular circumstance or set of circumstances, and including our shareholder-appointed directors and so forth, information sharing, and some other things that are in here. So, given that who's in charge, who's in control here is such a paramount issue to the public, all I'm saying is that it wouldn't jump out at you from reading this document, and I think we all sitting around the table appreciate that's the case. It wouldn't jump out, but the communication of it will need to be very carefully managed, massaged, whatever, to make sure that folks understand we haven't given away the candy store here. Okay.
Sure. I think it's a well-made point. The council clearly has significant influence over the operation of the business as a majority shareholder in itself, and then with the additional protections, that adds an additional layer of support for that influence. So it's a strong package on behalf of the community and the council to ensure this asset remains well managed with a clear line of sight to how it's managed as well.
Well, and I guess the underlying point, as a public company, a whole series of things trigger into play that don't exist today. Sure. In terms of our ability to oversight and get information and so forth about the workings of this, and empowering other third parties to see under the hood of how this port operates. So that's happening as well, just by virtue of making it a public company. So I think all of that needs to be pulled, obviously pulled out of here. So.
Neil.
Well, Mr. Chair, just speaking in support of those recommendations, I would make the point that as a consequence of introducing a range of what may do, well, in addition to the statutory obligations of a company of this nature, we have introduced a range of additional protections for the public interest in the asset, and I'm pleased to see that, and I state and restate that as a consequence, the interest and line of sight of the port by this council vastly improved, and vastly improved on the current arrangement and our current relationship with the port. So I'm very much in favour of this process, and applaud our newfound ability to, if you like, influence as the majority shareholder on the activities of the port. It's something I've thought was important with the current administration of the port, and I'm pleased to see the opportunity to beef up our opportunities to influence as the shareholder, which we simply haven't done in the past.
Neil? Paul, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really pleased with this particular paper and the decisions that we're going to be making today, because to me it reflects the fact that we've actually listened really hard to the submissions of the public on the submissions they made through our Port Have Your Say process, because there were a number of different concern themes that were raised during that particular process, which were outlined in the feedback responses that Jessica prepared for us when we made our decision at the time. And we've gone through and we've tried to, or we've dealt with the ones that we can, and gone through and I think better educated ourselves as a council as to our rights and responsibilities and so on. And I think that's really cool that we've actually taken that feedback on board that we've got from the public, and we've acted upon it, which is something we get accused of not doing, and we've actually done that in this instance. As far as I could work out, the only concern that we couldn't really cover ourselves on or do anything about was the ultimate ownership of the shares in the port that we're going to be selling, because that's just once the IPO happens and once the shares are sold, bang, we have absolutely no control over that, and no one does. So regardless of how you feel about that, there isn't anything we can do about that. But there's a whole bunch of other things that we've listened to the public about, and we've acted upon and educated ourselves about more, so that we're making a much more informed decision than what I think we would have been in the past, certainly for me. So I'm really comfortable with where we've got to on this.
Thank you, Paul. No other speakers? Alan, do you want to wrap up?
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I agree with Tom that there needs to be a well-prepared media statement or something to that effect to inform the public.
Thank you. Okay, now we are moving 2.4 and 3.5, which we're going to do separately. So all the other recommendations, all those in favour? Aye. Against? Unanimous. So now we'll move to 2.4. Debbie, you wish to speak to that?
Who's moved it?
Second to it.
No one.
Okay. Do we have a mover?
I'm a bit cheap.
Mover and a seconder? You want to speak?
Thank you, Chair. This is, to me, this is one of the most important steps that we're going to be taking. One of the things that I've heard a lot in discussions is that we didn't know what was going on in the port. We didn't know how the debt arrived. We didn't know a whole bunch of things. And I think this alleviates that in terms of having council-appointed directors on the board. I think that's a really useful look into what's going on there, which we didn't actually take advantage of in the past when we could have. So I'm really pleased to see this step being taken.
Who seconded that? Tom?
I did. I have nothing to add.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Neil.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'm wanting to make an amendment to the recommendation, and I'm asking us to be very transparent and clear by specifying that 2 councillors are appointed as directors. I was wondering whether there's a seconder for that. No, second?
He can't.
Sorry?
He can't. He seconded the other motion. He's ruled himself out.
Oh, that's a technical point. Thank you, Denton, for that. Is there any other seconder to change the wording really from minority shareholder appointment directors to councillors specifically? Sorry for lapses.
Well, I'll speak to the recommendation.
Yes, certainly.
Sorry, has it been seconded?
No, it lapsed.
Yeah, well, Mr. Chair, in speaking to the recommendation as it stands, I make this point that what we're really trying to say here is that we want to appoint councillors to the position. And that's what the public want to see. It concerns me that we're not transparent in this recommendation to appropriately qualified non-independent directors. That doesn't say councillors, when the reality is that we're likely to proceed with at least one council representative, director on the board, the appointment directors to provide direct insight into NPH. What my concern is that the public is concerned, we are concerned, we need to have eyes on, we need to be transparent here in regard to what we're intending. And I go to the second point I want to make, Mr. Chair, is this notion of 2 appropriately qualified non-independent directors. My view is the public are demanding that we have elected representation with direct position to influence the transaction, and that is their qualification. Being an elected representative is their qualification, and it concerns me that somehow councillors around the table, that's the quality they bring to the table. We have a lot of talk about the value and quality of commercial directors, but there are other values that need to be brought to the table, and I'm suggesting that the public, particularly by way of submission to council throughout this process, have asked for and in fact demanded that we are represented, their views are represented directly. So I make that point in regard to 2.4, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Neil. There was considerable discussion around this at the workshop. I'm not sure if, I don't know if you were there actually, but nevertheless, but do you recall it? To Tom and then Fenton.
With your indulgence, Mr. Chair, because I passed on my first opportunity not realizing that I'd be gazumped from procedurally addressing this matter. I endorse everything that Councillor Curtin has just said. I think he accurately states what the public thinks we would do under these circumstances. We will have a board of directors for that already will have 6 or 7 directors who presumably will be selected for their commercial acumen, as it were, assuming that that's apparently the only quality that one seeks in directors these days. But we have 2 other placements to make, and when I'm not sure when this will actually when the rubber will meet the road here. I presume we will not have a discussion as to who these directors are or will be until we have approved proceeding with a transaction. Is that correct? This is a moot issue unless we proceed. Is that correct?
I think the intent is you approve the creation of the roles today, and then from this point, a process can be established.
But are the roles only created on the condition that there's an IPO?
Correct.
Or are we saying that we would be adding public directors to the port absent an IPO?
These are associated with the premise that there's a creation of an IPO.
So there will be, at some point, there will be a discussion in which Neil and I will lead the charge as to who we think would be appropriate councillors, and he's made his position clear. I'll make mine clear. When that time comes, I will be arguing that it be 2 councillors, and I want that on the public record.
Thank you, Tom. Fenton?
I support the fact that shareholder has the control without any influence from any other owners in the port, assuming an IPO goes ahead, to have 2 appointments. I think that's pretty important. I just want to temper some of the conversation, though, that if you're a councillor director, you are bound by the Companies Act. The insight into the business, actually, you have to perform for the best interest of the company, and you can't just come running back to the council and tell the councillors what's going on. That's a no-go. And I'm not quite sure why my learned compatriots here keep banging that drum, because actually that won't be happening. The insight into the company will be done by the company directors en masse, and if there's councillors on the board before the IPO is completed, my firm view is they will recuse themselves from voting on the final deal. You can't have $1 each way in this stuff. It's too important. The market will be very nervous to think that is happening, and I think if we're going to proceed with this, and we're not there yet, we need to be very clear that the process is being run in a competent and commercial, professional way. If councillors are there post the final formation, that's, as has been said, still a discussion to be had. But the timing of this, who are our representatives, will be very, very important to get right, because the market will not be tolerating nickel and diming this stuff.
Debbie?
Thanks, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the huge amount of work that Jess, James, your team, Jess, and Blair and the Flagstaff and Bell Gully advisors have brought to bear with the decisions that we've been making today, because there's been a lot of time behind the scenes and a lot of workshops that have gone into place. I'd also like to just acknowledge that currently the Port of Napier directors have represent a diverse range of skills and competencies, and the port has flourished under independent directors for quite a number of years now. I'm strongly opposed to having councillor directors sit in the commercial space of port directors. I think that this should be left in the hands of commercial advisors, and that's where our region will be best placed in terms of going forward. This recommendation is backed up by the Office of the Auditor General, and if you go to their reports, they're pretty clear. appointing elected members to a CCO should be done by exception and not the norm. And it also goes on to say that should they be appointed, councillor directors are appointed, that needs to be an open and transparent method, subject to the same selection criteria as independent directors. Well, we've seen some evidence of the Port of Tauranga having councillor directors, and just because they're doing it, quite frankly, I don't think two wrongs make a right. Our window as representatives of this regional council strategic asset is will be through the NZX listing rules, which permits us as regional councillors to vote on the appointment and removal of all directors. We also have oversight through our statement of corporate intent, which will not change. So I don't believe we're going to be losing any overview or influence other than what other commercial entities do operate under. And any of the councillors around this table who believe that by having councillor appointed directors on that port board are going to get some sort of insight into what's going on are just simply dreaming, because all directors around that table will be bound by all of the Companies Act and all other relevant legislation. So in terms of suggesting that any insider trading will be going on, well, that just will not be the case.
You have to go, Mike. You are excused. Thank you. Any other speakers before I go back to Paul to wind up?
Thank you, Chair. Listening to the comments made by Councillors Curtin and Belford, absolutely we need to have that discussion in much greater detail as to the makeup of the directors that we're looking to appoint. And I agree with Councillor Curtin's comments that appropriate qualified could just mean being elected. So this particular motion does not preclude the appointment of councillor directors. It just means that we can go both ways, which is at this point in time is quite satisfactory. I'm a little surprised with the comments around having councillor appointed directors on the board of Napier Port Holdings won't give us an insight into what's going on in there. It doesn't mean that we can go and certainly influence decisions around the board and everything else, because that's how the board operates. But in terms of when things come up, we can certainly have this discussion as shareholder representatives, because that's the majority shareholder representatives, because that's what we are as a council, and we can advise our representatives of our views, or let those representatives know their views, which then can be represented around the board, which is something that we haven't got now, which we will gain in the future. Now that doesn't mean that they're required to obviously support every recommendation that we put their way and whatever, which means that they can still operate both as required under the Companies Act and also be our representatives around the table. I think it's a little bit of a scaremongering to say that simply because you're a director you have to stay silent. I think that's stretching that a little bit too far.
Thank you, Paul. So we move and second it. It's 2.4 as it is. All those in favour? Aye. Aye. Against?
Against.
Should record that.
Chair, I'll move 3.5.
Do you wish to record
I thought they
that?
went together. Oh, yes, please. I thought they were both together.
No, they weren't. No. 3.5. You want to move?
Did you want to call division on it?
I think Debbie wanted to move the first part of that 3.5.
Do we have a mover? Do we have a second?
Did you? I said division. Yes, please.
Yes, you want. Yes. Oh, we take division. She did say yes. So we division on 2.4. All those in favour? Aye. Against? And we'll record Debbie's against. Okay, we're taking 3.5 as a separate one. Do we have a move?
I've got a move.
Thank you. Second up. 3.5.
Sorry, just to be clear, Chair, I understood that Councillor Hewitt wanted to move the first part of this so that this was taken in two parts. Is that correct? So
But I thought it'd been done.
she did raise that request earlier on. So if there's a seconder for that.
Do you want to move it?
I will move notes that Napier Port will continue to be required to prepare and publish a statement of corporate intent. I'm very happy with that part of it.
So if you call that 3.5.1.
And what's the second?
Do we have a seconder for that? Do we divide this up?
I'll second.
You second that? Alan does, and Fenton has his hand up too, but we'll take Alan. Okay, Debbie, do you want to talk to that then?
No, it's just governance, standard governance.
Alan, do you wish to talk?
No comment.
No comment. Do we, any other speakers? So, all those in favour of doing that? Aye. Against? We're just doing that. And they're just dropping the other bit out, are we?
So if someone can move.
Hang on, I'm happy to move the second part, Mr. Chair.
Okay. But the affiliated, the second part then? Neil moves the second part?
Is affiliated to non-independent.
Correct.
Yeah. Second, Tom? Neil, just to speak?
Yeah, well, just speaking to it, Mr. Chair. Again, this is simply bolstering the ability and capacities of council to express its view as the majority shareholder. Happy to do that, take any opportunity to do just that. I would comment, Mr. Chair, that by so doing, it's abundantly clear that this offer, if it proceeds, is a majority-held public shareholding. The public and investors know that. They appreciate that. They know, and we've already expressed this in a prior recommendation, where it says non-independent directors. That means they are representing the shareholder. Somehow we've got this ridiculous notion that we need to bow down before some unknown God that says a director cannot have and represent and have influence at the board table. That's simply not true. That's why we've got a non-independent director nominee. And whether that's a councillor, it's a debate for another day. But the reality of that is that those folk will have influence around the board table. In fact, the investors, and I've heard this shroud waving about scaring investors away from taking part in any opportunity here, they may in fact be attracted because in the reality is it is a public asset. It's a little like Air New Zealand attracts the interests of investors because at the end of the day those investors know that the government will step in and rescue should there be a need to rescue. And the same applies here. This council, at the end of the day, will always protect its majority interests in the port. A good reason to invest, I would have thought, as opposed to this notion that somehow councillor directors would somehow pollute the waters and bring the house down. It's nonsense. So any effort, Mr. Chair, in terms of 3.5.2 is to be supported.
Thank you, Neil. Tom?
Yeah, I would think that, quote, our directors will speak silently and carry a big stick. I support this.
Paul and then Debbie.
Thank you, Chair. One of the big controls that we've talked about quite a bit is this ability at the end of the day, as the majority shareholder, to appoint or sack the board members of the port. That's a powerful tool that we have to maintain control in terms of what happens on the port. Now, for me personally, if I certainly don't want to go around sacking the whole board every other day just because they pissed me off for one reason or another. I would like to know if there's any muppets on that particular board. I want to know who that particular director is, so that we can deal with that case on a case-by-case basis. And unless we have our own people on that board that are representing us, then we're not going to know who those particular individuals are. So if we want to make an example of someone, we want to choose the right person, not just drawing someone out of a hat.
Thank you, Paul. Debbie?
Oh, thank you. In terms of the Muppets comment, I'll just remind councillors that we will be voting on the appointment and removal of all directors. I'd also add any directors around that table all carry the same responsibilities equally. So as we've understood in our workshops, directors will be reimbursed. And over the course of a long-term plan, 2 additional councillor directors will be the thick end of $1 million in expenses. So I think that money's far better used back in the ratepayers' dividend pockets.
Debbie. Okay, Neil, back to you. Do you want to wrap us up?
Oh, I've probably said enough.
Said enough? Okay, so we have a mover and a seconder. All those in favour? Aye. Against?
That's against.
Yours recorded, Debbie? Okay, thank you very much. We will. I don't know whether we can do item 12.
So, Chair, it won't be long, and I suggest we also just do 13 while Blair's here so he can get away before lunch, which is just the IPO project update. So we can whip through these next 3 minutes.
Whip through anything. Okay, we'll do item 12 then, Blair. You don't want to stay for lunch with us.
I can do 13 if you... 13's pretty straightforward. If we jump to that.
Let's just do 12, I think.
12 is Jessica.
Well, 12 is straightforward too.
12's me. So we're asking you, so firstly, this decision paper is to adopt an amendment to the long-term plan.
Which we have to do.
It's an important step in this process, so the long-term plan must be amended before you can make a substantial decision to proceed. The long-term plan is the primary planning document for council, so the amendment needs to be reflected in the long-term plan before you can make a decision to proceed with an IPO. So the long-term plan, the amendment was consulted on as part of the consultation in the last quarter of last calendar year. So we did ask you in the papers to reflect on the submission analysis which was provided to you in December in terms of any feedback related to the long-term plan amendment. I did receive clearance from Audit New Zealand on the amendment this morning at 7:30, so we have had a clear bill of health from Audit New Zealand. They're happy with the minor adjustments that have been made since the consultation, which are outlined under the final amendment section point 8 in the paper. So that was
brave
just
of you putting it in. I did highlight it.
What's that?
That we received Audit New Zealand's opinion.
Yes, we have received an opinion, so we had 3 hours clearance before the beginning of the meeting, which was quite good. They're happy with the adjustments that have been made, and they're not material, so they don't affect the fact that we've already consulted on this. So you do have the extracts from the document, which are highlighted where we have made any adjustments, and we'll be updating the long-term plan on our website, and all of our published copies will be updated with the amendment post-adoption today.
Okay, questions? Fenton?
Well, on the basis that the auditor's gone through this, I'm happy to move, Chair.
Unless there are any questions? Mover and a seconder. All those in favour?
Aye.
You got a question, Paul?
Oh, no, I was going to make a comment, but that's all right.
Go on.
Hammer's fallen, Chair.
No,
Used to have a
I'm
question.
fine.
It's Tuesday. There, he's ruthless. He was ruthless.
It's lunchtime coming up. It's okay.
You do
Do you
one more,
think,
yeah.
Blair, I mean, this could be...
There's not much to cover.
you think so? Item 13, we will give it a go.
First, we should vote.
I thought we did.
Moved and seconded.
Moved to second. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Thank you. So item 13.
Thank you, Chair.
You do that in 5 minutes, can
Yes, look, the majority of the content in the report has been covered off by your decisions today. So that's a step towards the completion of the preparation for the IPO process. Work on all the other work streams remains ongoing. And at this stage, we're targeting the council meeting on the 1st of May for a substantive decision on whether to proceed. So I might leave the update at that and take questions, Chair.
Questions on the update? Paul, we'll get you this time.
What's that?
We'll get you in this time.
We'll get them stopped, that's right. Through you, Chair. Blair, one of the things we've talked about during workshops and that is the timing of everything. So with the jitters in the financial markets that have come up this week, I'm curious to know when we would. I know we're looking at 1st of May to make a decision as to whether to proceed or not. When would you expect us to make a decision as to push the actual go button, even if we're assuming we make that decision on the 1st of May?
Well, look, there'll be flexibility in the program to evaluate the financial conditions at the time in the lead up to a final decision. So to answer your question, certainly there's an opportunity to not proceed if the conditions are not satisfactory at the time, and that would be made in the lead up to the final listing.
Yep.
Have your stocks gone down?
My stocks?
You said the financial upsetting of the financial.
Oh, yeah, there's been a whole bunch of stuff going on the last couple of days.
Brexit.
Don't you read the papers?
Any other questions for Blair? Penton?
Move.
And second? Penton, do you wish to speak to it? Neil?
Oh, just briefly, Mr. Chair, because this is probably the opportunity to acknowledge the work of staff and the team behind the scenes doing the due diligence, and the public can be utterly satisfied that not one stone is left unturned to get the structure right. And just congratulate the team and Blair in particular for leading it in such a way that me as a councillor, on behalf of the public, has got complete confidence that the technical process is first class.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. And I would just endorse that, and I think all the council would endorse that. Okay, we have a mover and a seconder. All those in favour? Aye. Against? It's carried. It's time for lunch. Thank you, councillors, and thank you, Blair.
Chair, I will take leave. Now we've got through the bulk of that, if that's okay by you.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Are you off to Wellington?